This is a story about how one doctor's signature, one investigator's word, and one verdict can turn a life into a countdown to lights out. The main character is Sophia. She's a trans woman from Kazakhstan, and she had to go through what should not happen to anyone anywhere: humiliating exams, a trial, a transfer, and years in a penal colony. We will break down how the system meets those who do not fit the usual frame, who makes the decisions, how they are made, why a medical board suddenly becomes a weapon, and how a report turns into a script you are not allowed to rewrite. Sophia will tell how "we'll sort it out" became 7 years, how obedience is measured in a colony, what earns you penalties, and why sometimes the only way to survive is to refuse to let them take your voice. This is not a sensation and not a pity piece. It is a detailed analysis, what really happened, where the mechanisms broke, and what it feels like to be told for a long time that you do not exist. Sophia is a trans woman from Kazakhstan. Before the story we are telling, she lived an ordinary life, work, friends, plans, and an attempt to rebuild herself after hard years. The people around her knew Sophia simply as a woman. She did not discuss her past or medical details, not because she was ashamed, but because privacy is her right. Everything changed when comments about her identity leaked online. In those comments appeared the name of a woman who would later become the victim in the case. They knew each other from a distance, through mutual doctors and acquaintances. From that moment, Sophia's personal story turned into a legal case with loud wording and rigid procedures. Then came medical boards and exams. Formally, they were there to verify facts. In practice, they were humiliation and the curiosity of strangers. Sophia was taken to gynecologists as a rare case. Consiliums were assembled. Her body and surgeries were discussed like a display item. Instead of protecting dignity, medicine became a tool of pressure. The investigation was built around who to consider Sophia to be and how to pin it down on paper. Doctors' words and the wording of protocols turned out stronger than her own words about herself. When the right to your name, pronouns, and medical confidentiality is replaced by an expert opinion, you lose control over your own reality. The court was the next stage. There, numbers and articles push out the human context. The story of a relationship, consent, and the boundaries of privacy gets simplified to a couple of checkboxes. In the colony, bureaucracy becomes the routine of survival, a daily regime, penalties for trifles, and constant tests of loyalty. There are 3 knots in this story that we will unravel. First, medicine as a machine of stigma. Who decides what must be proven about a person's body and how? Second, the law and its blind spots. How a formal gender marker affects charges, restraint measures, and the sentence. Third, the colony. What happens when a person's daily safety depends on the regime and on arbitrariness? We will show how at every step, from an online comment to a verdict, decisions are made not by life but by paper. And how, despite that, Sophia tries to hold on to simple things: her name, her voice, and the right to boundaries. The main actors are Sophia, the victim, whose name surfaces in the comments, doctors and experts turned into arbiters of identity, the investigator in the court that prefer numbers over nuance, and the penal system, where living by the rules sometimes matters more than the truth. That is the background. Next, we go step by step. How the story unfolded, where it broke, and what it says about how medicine, the law, and prison work when someone who does not fit the template ends up inside them. Sophia says she used to love the quiet of morning messages. You wake up, open your phone, and see normal things: a meme from a friend, a reminder about a meeting, a couple of likes. That morning there was a notification that hurt to read, a link to a post where people discussed her name, her body, and who she really was. At first she thought it was a silly flame war that would fall apart in a day. Those things do not last long. They do last when curiosity and fear are involved. Sophia worked, met friends, and saved up to fix her kitchen. In her chats they used her name. At her cafe, the barista already knew she ordered a latte without sugar. Her life was built from small habits, like a construction set. Then, one piece was pulled out, and it yanked on another and another. The post spread through chats where people knew her, where they did not, and where they knew someone who knows. By evening, her phone was full of questions. Is that about you? Have you seen it? You better delete things. She got tired of explaining that she had a right to live without explanations. The hardest moment is not when they call you by the wrong name. The hardest is when people you know act like they need a certificate from your life. Prove you are you. It is a funny phrase. If you forget that it always hides a threat, if you do not prove it, others will prove you instead. Sophia tried to do what adults do when the flames are coming to the door. She wrote to the group admin and asked to hide the discussion. The admin answered, "This is sensitive. People have a right to know the truth." She did not specify what truth she meant. Names began to surface. Among them was a woman with whom Sophia had a painful conversation a couple of months earlier. It had ended with, "Let's not." No big words, just two tired people. Now that name came up next to victim, not yet in the case file, only in the comments, like a premonition. Sophia caught herself closing her social profiles for the first time in a long while, hiding public posts and setting hard message filters. It was not paranoia, it was rational. When you are treated like a topic, you have to build your boundaries. The next day, the clinic where she had seen her endocrinologist for years called. In a tone like, "The store manager needs to count inventory," they invited her to come in to clarify data. There, they treated her like a rare case to be discussed during cigarette breaks. "We have a quick question about your papers. Did you have surgery? Where?" And a dozen more curious but supposedly necessary lines. Sophia showed a referral, proof that she was entitled to hormones, that everything matched guidelines. In response, they suggested an additional exam. The word additional often means unnecessary, but it makes us feel safer. The exam was less medicine and more a show made of shuffled papers. One doctor, another, a third, and then a concilium. People in white coats discussed how to put it all down. In the sex field, there was a letter that did not match how she lived, looked, or how people addressed her. It was not easy to fix. They told her, "We need a conclusion, and to get a conclusion you need a basis, and a basis requires an expert evaluation." The circle closed quickly, like a turnstile. That evening, she told her friends how she suddenly had to explain to strangers why she had that name and why she wanted the same in her medical card. Friends gave silly advice, as friends do when they are scared. Just don't go. File a complaint. We'll switch clinics. A complaint is a whole novel. Switching clinics is no cure, and it does not change the fact that in a city where everyone knows everyone, the story was already moving ahead of her. A week later, the first official call came. An investigator. The tone was careful, almost polite, but every phrase had the stiffness of protocol. "You need to give an explanation." Sophia came with a lawyer a friend had recommended. The office was clean and smelled like paper. They asked her to tell it in order. She told it. About meeting, about the messages, about the break that ended with, "Let's not." They nodded and asked for details. The questions were about dates, not feelings, about was and was not how. When the conversation reached her medical data, the lawyer asked to stop. Medical secrecy is not a toy. The investigator nodded and asked her to bring anything that could help with objectivity. In translation, the more papers, the easier it is to close questions that are hard to understand. Sophia left the office feeling like her life had been packed into a folder and labeled in pencil. Pencil is convenient. You can erase and rewrite. Meanwhile, the nervous life of everyday things kept going. Her job had deadlines. A client waited for mock-ups. Her mother called and asked when she would visit. Sophia chose not to tell her mother too much. She said she was busy. She also told herself that she had the right not to turn every talk into a report. But the phone buzzed again. A friend forwarded a screenshot from a chat where they discussed the case. The words deceit, fraud, and medical fiction appeared. The text did not name her directly, but everyone knew who it was about. In moments like that, you want to turn off the internet and go outside. Outside was just as loud. The first clarification visit turned into a second. At the second, a commission appeared. They treated her formally and correctly, but like an object rather than a person. They said, "Please present," and "Please sign." She read the papers and heard lines like, "A complicated case, records are inconsistent, and we should clarify once more." Every once more made it sound like they expected her to doubt herself. That kind of thing is oddly exhausting when you keep explaining the obvious in a calm voice. Meanwhile, her lawyer contacted people who could write references. Colleagues wrote good things, neighbors too. These papers became a counterweight to the others, where she was reduced to inconsistency and presence of signs. Sophia collected those pages as proof that she exists like this, in a normal way. But the system loves things you can measure with a ruler. Other people's opinions and human memory always lose to the bullet points on a form. Then came the moment when privacy finally cracked. A letter with a delivery notice arrived at her door. It listed requests for documents and a summons. A neighbor caught the mail carrier to sign for it because Sophia was out. That evening, he handed her the envelope, his eyes politely curious. Those looks are not full of malice. They are full of something worse, a readiness to discuss. Sophia closed the door and realized that now her story lived not in her phone, but in the stairwell. This path to the verdict was not yet called a criminal case. It was a jigsaw puzzle where the picture was already guessable, even though many pieces were missing. Some people slipped in pieces from other boxes. Some tried to jam the same piece into different places. Sophia did what she could. Answered letters, checked wording, insisted on her name, corrected pronouns, asked to be treated like a person, and she prepared for the next step, which was not her choice. Inside that period, there's a small detail people usually miss. Sophia set timers on her phone. When to take pills, when to turn off notifications, when to go for a short walk. These timers were her way to get control back. When many people decide for you, it matters to decide for yourself when to go to the pharmacy and when not to open social media. This is not heroism. It is a way to survive at a normal pace. The first part of the story ends not with a verdict or a headline, but with the feeling that ordinary life stopped being private. Next will come medicine as a stage, expert reports, conciliums, ornate wording, and how paper learns to speak louder than a person. But it began here, on the day when a phone notification outweighed a morning latte and talks with friends. Medicine entered her life not as help, but as a stage with an audience that already had tickets. It started in a normal room with a stool by the wall, a plastic cup for tests, and a calm nurse who did not care. Then, the doors began to open wider. People in white appeared in the hallway who were interested to see the case. Their interest sounded polite, but felt like a museum tour. Note the rare configuration here. The first concilium took place in a narrow room that smelled of antiseptic and dry air. 2 gynecologists, an endocrinologist, the clinic's lawyer, and someone who said they were from administration. Sophia was told it was for objectivity. The word became a refrain. The questions started with paperwork. When, where, what surgeries do you have the documents? Then they moved closer to the body. What symptoms, how she tolerates therapy, what earlier tests showed, why those doses. She answered briefly and calmly. She knew that any extra word would be put into the protocol as additional information and later grow into a problem. The doctors talked to each other over her. It is a special style. The patient reports, the patient denies. According to the patient, no one says, "Sophia said." Phrases are designed so that no one carries personal responsibility for meaning. When it came time to record her sex, the table had no space for life. The letter in the field required proof the clinic was in no hurry to give. We need a commission conclusion to update the chart. The conclusion depended on grounds, and the grounds on an expert evaluation through a bureau. The loop closed quickly, like a turnstile. They asked her to sign consent for an extended exam. The paper was 2 pages in small print. It had a line about using data for education. Sophia crossed it out and wrote, "I do not agree." The room got quieter. The lawyer politely noted that few people do that. She shrugged. If her life had become a document, it should at least carry the mark of her hand. They brought a new form without the disputed line, a small win. It did not make it easier, but it made things clearer. With exams, there's a thin line between necessary and curiosity. In the halls, young doctors stopped her and asked questions to understand practice. Some wanted to clarify details. Some sincerely wanted to help. Each question was a tiny reminder. You are an object, not a subject. In the operating record, they discussed sutures, access points, anesthesia protocols, as if it were mechanics and not a life lived on the table. Sophia answered in single words and kept bringing the talk back to current care. If you let them open the door to your past, they will study you like an archive. Meanwhile, her longtime endocrinologist stayed close. It was a rare case of human care without extra words. The doctor wrote not only lab numbers, but also phrases that protected her. The patient is on therapy according to recommendations. Response is stable. No side effects identified. Such notes become a shield. They are boring, but sometimes boredom saves you from other people's fantasies. In that office, they talked to her as a person. Outside the door, the fare of wording resumed. The board added a psychiatrist, not because Sophia had complaints, but because it is required for a comprehensive assessment. The psychiatrist's stamp is like a seal on an envelope. Without it, they will not accept it. The talk was slow. The doctor asked about childhood, school, self-identification. At the end, he casually asked how she sees herself in the passport. Sophia felt tired and answered directly. The passport says one thing, her life is another, and the passport is waiting its turn. The doctor wrote, ambivalent attitude to legal fixation. This phrase would later be quoted in another office as if it were suspicious. On a separate day, they did an ultrasound. By medical indications, it was unnecessary, but in the records it said, to clarify reconstructive changes. The tech worked fast and calmly. No comments, no scientific novelty stare. Sophia was almost grateful for the silence. Sometimes help is simply professional quiet. The report went into the stack and lowered the temperature around her body. Fewer reasons to look where no one should. The key moment came when the expert bureau asked for more materials to decide on updating the medical paperwork. The list looked like a mini archive: reports, discharge notes, copies of questionnaires, test results, and also character references. That point exposed the system most of all. Medicine asked for character references to certify that you are not a danger, but a part of society. Sophia brought letters from work and neighbors. They were calm and warm. These sheets did not heal her, but they raised her pulse where her heart usually feels tired. The second board differed from the first in that everyone already agreed in advance. Their job was not to find the truth, but to fit meaning neatly into boxes. The questions were shorter and technical. No one asked how she lived. They asked whether to recommend updating the gender field in the chart before legal changes or to refrain. In the end, they decided to conditionally recommend, with caveats. The caveats were so long that no one could understand them without a translator. But even with them, it was movement. On paper, there appeared a line where the word patient in the feminine no longer fought with the table field. The whole process exhausted her not by pain but by turning her body into a field of approvals. When you are viewed for a long time under a magnifying glass, you stop being a person and become a set of issues to be resolved. Sophia knew that without those stamps and signatures, things would be harder later. Courts like documents more than people. So she endured. But every time she went outside, she checked whether someone's marker had left a visible mark on her face, like after a lecture where you were a drawing on the board. At some point, she started writing about herself in the third person in her notes. The patient took a pill. The patient went to the appointment. It was not losing herself. It was protection. If everyone talks about you as a case, sometimes it is easier to become a case on paper to keep the person alive in your head. She paused after each visit, bought water, sat on a bench, and breathed evenly. She reminded herself she had a home, a blanket, music on her phone, and a friend who would text, "Do not answer, just send a heart. I am here." When the medical part reached a conditional end, she had several opinions in hand that did not contradict one another. They did not say the obvious in plain words, but they did not deny her name either. It looked like a weak compromise with reality. With those papers, she moved on to the halls where objectivity is measured differently and where other people's words become legal facts. Medicine dropped the curtain. The investigation raised its own. The investigator started politely, like he was inviting her to a business meeting. He liked the word objectivity, but in his tone it sounded like convenience. A convenient picture fits into 3 pages of protocol and does not spill into nuance. First, he requested her devices: phone, laptop, cloud access. The lawyer insisted on an inventory and copies, not seizure until better times, because seized things sometimes come back ages later in missing pieces. They made a mirror copy. Sophia sat in the hallway and watched a person in gloves calmly open her life like a box of cables. Personal chats became correspondence. Vacation photos turned into images. Voice notes became audio files. Each file got a number and a short note. The number does not care about context. By evening, she received the first protocol for review. On paper, everything looked neat and smooth, as if consequences had been ironed flat. Messages were trimmed for meaning, removing mid-sentences and jokes, leaving dry ends without tone. Where the chat had "meet up" plus an emoji, the document had "meet up." Humor, doubt, and pauses disappeared as noise. In their place came straight lines that can be stacked into intent. The lawyer asked to add a note. The context of the correspondence was not preserved in full. The investigator nodded and added, "The defense's opinion is recorded." It sounds decent, but often means the checkbox is ticked and the course stays the same. Witness interrogations began. People who saw, heard, and know from words. Those words have a systemic magic. They replace memory with a construct that is easy to quote. Witnesses recalled fragments fitted to a needed timeline. Where dates were missing, they got anchors. Was it after the May holidays? Then it was early June. When someone got mixed up, the investigator gently steered them back to the correct version. No one asked how people normally make mistakes when retelling someone else's life. Mistakes were treated as extra. In another room, they did a linguistic analysis of the chats. The expert explained that the goal was to establish meaning and intent. He placed accents like a conductor, and the meaning stopped being alive. Emojis, interjections, that after a hard question lost weight. Only verbs remained. Verbs easily form the chain intended, did. Sophia listened to her own speech retold by someone else and thought that language is alive only until you pin it to a stand. The topic of the gender marker in documents appeared in every office where anything had to be clarified. She brought medical reports where "patient" in the feminine stood without quotes. In response, she got the question, "And in the passport?" The passport said something else. That something else stuck to the case as a constant caveat. In the protocols, the phrase was, "a person who identifies as," then he, she, swam back and forth like fish in a tank, depending on habit. The lawyer recorded violations, insisting on respect for her name and pronouns. The investigator agreed on paper, but in the next document, it all went back to how it was. Paper respects paper. One morning, Sophia was summoned to clarify testimony and kept in the office almost until night. They call it procedural efficiency. Since you came, we will do everything at once. The questions came faster. She was reminded about liability for false statements. It is a standard phrase, but it lays a cold hand on your shoulder, especially when the truth depends on wording. They tried to ask leading questions. Did you understand your actions could be perceived as? Several times she brought the talk back to facts. What, where, when, who was present. Each time the talk slid into evaluation, the lawyer asked to record an objection. There were many objections. It felt like they would become the main point, not what happened, but that the defense kept objecting. At the same time, they decided on restraint measures. The investigator hinted he could request detention because of risks of pressure on witnesses and the possibility of destroying evidence. It is a standard set of words that fits almost anyone. The defense brought references, stable employment, a lease, and tickets to a medical appointment. Anything that shows a person is settled in life and not about to vanish. In the end, the measure was softer, but she had a travel ban and the obligation to appear on summons. Each appearance became a small loyalty test. Check in, get a new paper, and hear the familiar for objectivity. At some point, a document appeared that made Sophia stop and stare. It said, "The victim reported," followed by phrases written in someone else's language, not because the person was lying, but because paper cannot hold fragile boundaries of meaning. The talk that once ended with "let's not" stretched out in the protocol and turned into a conflict with consequences. Sophia did not try to argue with someone else's feelings. She argued with how those feelings had been turned into facts. It is a losing position because you cannot refute feelings and you cannot love facts in a protocol. Then came searches at her home. The district officer, witnesses, neat bags. Searches have a strange aesthetic. People work calmly and correctly, but what they do still burns the air. They took flash drives, an old phone, and a password notebook she had long stopped updating. Everything was recorded. She signed seals on bags. In the evening, the apartment felt slightly different, like after a renovation no one asked for. Sophia stacked the remaining papers, closed the window to block the stairwell noise, and fell asleep in her clothes. The investigation ordered a psychological and psychiatric evaluation due to contradictions. In cases like this, contradictions appear easily. It is enough for two people to remember the same evening differently. The experts asked about impulsivity, empathy, and boundaries. In the end, they wrote, "Critical thinking preserved, no tendency to manipulative behavior." The dry phrase was rare support because it did not include cliches about a desire to dominate or personality peculiarities. But support on an expert paper is always half-sized. You need another sheet to make someone pay attention. By the end of the investigation, the case looked like scaffolding around a house where people have long lived. Everything stood on crossbars made of wording. Where something shook, they added, "taking into account." Where it did not fit, they wrote, "based on the totality of information." Step by step, the defense prepared its version, collecting simple but stubborn things: the sequence of events, full chat context, medical records that show how a normal person makes normal choices in daily life. They asked for a face-to-face confrontation. They asked to attach full logs. They asked to correct pronouns and protocols. Some of it was approved. Some was rejected as not relevant to the subject. The subject of the case narrowed so much that there was no space left for a life. When Sophia was told the investigative actions were complete, she did not feel relief. She felt empty. Ahead was court, where the language would be even drier and emotions even more dangerous. She took copies of the materials, a thick folder with her name on the cover, written like a sentence. At home, she put the folder on a shelf so she would not see it out of the corner of her eye. She made tea, opened the window, and listened to the courtyard. The courtyard sounded like normal life, a couple arguing about a delivery, a child kicking a ball, someone playing music too loud. It felt strange that this simple noise existed next to the way documents swapped causes and effects. The investigation did not break Sophia. It dried the language around her. That may be the most dangerous thing, when your speech stops sounding because it was translated into procedural talk. She set up her small timers again, reminded herself not to answer messages after 10 at night, and called her friend. She said briefly, "We move on." The friend answered with a heart. Sometimes the best argument against the system is not words, but someone who stays nearby and does not ask why again. Next came the trial. That meant more names, more dates, and an attempt to return meaning to words that had been assigned numbers. Court began by seating people while leaving the meaning standing in the hall. The room was cool and smelled of paper and old wood. The judge spoke fast and sparingly. The clerk called out names like he was checking roll at school. Sophia sat next to her lawyer and, as they had agreed, looked at the table, not at faces. It helps you avoid reading someone's expression and trying to predict the outcome by their eyebrows. The prosecutor read out the charges in an even voice with no irritation or doubt. The sentence was reduced to a few steps built like stairs. Here are the messages, here are the meetings, here is the interpretation of those meetings, and here are the consequences. Where life had fine threads, the text had dense wording. The lawyer stood and briefly reminded the court that evidence should be read in full, not like a book of quotes. The judge nodded and said, "We will go through it in order." That always sounds like a promise, though it is usually just a schedule. The victim spoke first. Her voice shook, not from paralysis, but from normal human nerves. She talked about feelings, expectations, how she understood things later, and how she now sees the past. There was a lot of pain in her words, but pain does not always equal guilt. Sophia listened without interrupting. The lawyer asked careful questions, not about feelings, but about dates and sequences, how they met, what exact words were in the chat, who went where. The prosecutor objected. The judge struck some questions as irrelevant. Where there needed to be context, only a timeline remained. Then came witnesses. Colleagues, neighbors, people who saw and heard. Testimony gathered into a picture where many things were guessed between the lines. The lawyer asked to read full chats, not cutouts. He asked to attach the psychological and psychiatric report where it clearly said, critical thinking preserved, no tendency to manipulation. The court accepted it, but without emphasis. In moments like that, it feels like important pages become underlay sheets, and on top, they still put whatever is brighter. The hardest hearings were about identity. Formally, the court is not there to treat people and not there to decide who you are. In reality, a legal marker pulls charges and qualifications behind it. When the medical records say patient in the feminine and the passport has another letter, the room becomes a lecture hall on a topic where everyone has an opinion. The lawyer asked everyone to use Sophia's name and to fix pronouns as in the medical records. The judge allowed it and tried to do it himself. The prosecutor sometimes slipped into he. Witnesses stumbled. The clerk wrote what he heard. The lawyer stood again. Please correct the protocol. The protocol was corrected. It looked like a small win, but felt more like a game with an eraser. One day they read out the linguistic report. The expert confidently spoke of intention, subtext, and communicative dominance. In the transcript, it sounded impressive and turned living conversation into dry bones. Where the chat had "let's think," the report had a call to align positions. Where it had "I am okay if you are okay," it became consent was obtained. The lawyer showed printouts of full dialogues where you could see how doubt and clarification changed the meaning. The judge frowned and asked to be brief. Brief about complex things comes out harsh. The defense asked for a face-to-face confrontation. The court agreed. It was heavy and short. People almost never remember the same evening the same way. Everyone has their own boundaries and their own way to explain pain. After the confrontation, it became clear that court is not about who suffered more. It is about how this fits into articles of law. This is an unpleasant discovery, but it gives clarity. In this room, they do not make justice. They make a decision. There were procedural battles. The defense asked to exclude some evidence as inadmissible, copies of files without a full chain of custody, protocols with wrong pronouns, and printouts with missing context. Some things were excluded. Some were found admissible in totality. A comma could shift the outcome for years. Sophia held on to rituals, the same breakfast, the same route to court, the same blanket in the evening. Rituals help when other people fill your calendar. Closing arguments condensed the positions. The prosecutor spoke the language of the statute and canned phrases. Proven, the totality of evidence, intent is confirmed. The defense spoke about life, context, human boundaries, and that doubts are resolved in favor of the accused. They asked the court to look at the sequence of events, not at labels. They asked the court not to replace complexity with a familiar stamp. The judge listened, took notes, and set a date for the verdict. The day of the verdict always smells like what you ate in the morning. Later, Sophia remembered a banana and some water she could hardly swallow. The room was full but quiet. The judge came in, sat down, and lifted a stack of sheets. He read without pauses, as experience dictates. In the first paragraphs there is always hope. Maybe he will say, acquit, or send for further investigation. But the steady speed gave nothing away. When "find guilty" and the numbers sounded, they stood next to her like two convoy officers. 7 years. A term that empties a whole shelf of your life. The lawyer stood at once. Appeal. The judge nodded. You understand the procedure for appeal. It is dry, but those words hide the only door not yet closed. Sophia heard her blood in her ears and tried to find her friend's eyes. Her friend nodded, not like a cosmic sign of support, but a simple, I am here. It is enough to stand up. After the verdict, there is always a small domestic chaos. Someone tries to talk. Someone cries in the hall. Someone argues that this is how it should be. Sophia walked toward the exit and held the handrail because it was firmer than words. Outside the sun was bright, as if the world decided to play on contrast. The lawyer briefly explained the next steps, how much time they had to file, what grounds the appeal had, what else they could gather. Work phrases sounded like lifebuoys thrown not into a storm but into thick water. In the evening, she returned home and put the verdict on the table. The paper felt heavier than it was. She reread it to make sure she did not mishear, though there was no way to hear it differently. The text was full of familiar lines she had seen before. In totality, taking into account, testimony assessed critically. It is a language that pretends it is not about people. Sophia turned off the light, left the desk lamp on, and began a to-do list. Not because a book on self-help told her to, but because a list is a way to get tomorrow back. The court ended not with a period but with parentheses. Inside them were an appeal, new dates, and a chance to shift meaning a few centimeters. But the main turn had already happened. The system put a number next to her name. Now she would have to live, speak, file papers, and wait for hearings so that this number did not become the only word about her. The colony was ahead. There, the usual hold on becomes the weight of a brick. For now the room was quiet, and for the first time in a long time, her phone was silent. The colony turned out to be not a place, but a way time moves. Here, days are measured not by events, but by checks. Morning begins with roll call, where last names sound like serial numbers. The name Sophia did not fit this list at first, as if the letters were too soft for a hard table. She raised her hand and calmly repeated, Sophia. At first there was a smirk in response, then the usual, as in the documents, then a short argument that ended the same way. Record it the way I ask. In a week the guard stopped pausing. If you rub a mechanism for long enough, sometimes it slips in favor of a person. The hardest thing in a colony is not the walls or the fences. The hardest is the moments when you seem to not exist. It happens when the guard talks only to the shoulder patches and not to the people, when the crew leader marks a 1 by your bunk and never looks up from the notebook, when the line at the prison store is longer than your weekly call with your mother. Sophia quickly realized that survival here is a set of micro-habits. Learn the water schedule in the washroom. Do laundry at night when it is empty. Always keep thread and a pin in your pocket. Do not enter arguments where tone matters more than meaning. And every day build in one small reminder to yourself. You are a person with a name. Neighbors in the barracks are a lottery. She got a bunkmate who loved detective novels and could retell plots for hours without using names. It was oddly calming. In their corner they hung a 2-line routine. Morning exercise, evening write to loved ones. Writing means holding the thread that someone else holds from the other side. Letters went to her mother, her friend, and her lawyer. In each letter, Sophia left a small line at the bottom. My name is Sophia. Write it that way. That line was an anchor. Court and prison papers can argue. The handwriting of loved ones does not argue. Work in the colony is a constant proof of usefulness. Sewing, packing, sorting. The quotas are set so you always fall a little short. If you miss, you get a reprimand. Reprimands mean fewer rewards. At first, they tried to place her on a neutral station to avoid tension. In practice, it meant the worst shift and less access to hot water. Sophia calmly wrote a request. Please assign by skill. She had design experience, a steady hand, and attention to detail. 2 weeks later, they moved her to a station that needed straight stitches and patience. There, the language of hands matters more than words. It worked in her favor. Busy fingers keep thoughts from burning out. Disciplinary penalties in the colony appear out of thin air. You can get one for improper storage of a cup. You can get one for an unestablished form of address if you say hello instead of comrade. A few times Sophia felt like pushing back hard, but chose another way. Formal complaints and requests to correct protocols. Each paper first gets a skeptical look, then irritation, then a tired, registered. The paper she had hated on the outside became a bread knife inside. Not food, but it helps you cut things. There are rare sources of life in a colony. The library survives thanks to an enthusiast with no illusions. Every week, Sophia took one classic and one reference book. She read about rights, rules, and conditions, and how to appeal penalties. She remembered how boring regulations seemed on the outside, and how here they became an instruction for breathing. There was also a psychologist, a tired person who knew how to keep quiet. With them, she could talk about simple things, how to survive another round of wrong pronouns, how not to fall into pointless anger, how not to take other people's conclusions into yourself. Therapy in such places does not fix the world, but sometimes it brings your pulse back. Medical care felt like someone testing the past for strength. Hormones on a schedule that you have to scrape from storerooms, exams stripped down to forms without a person, talks about who must and who must not. Sophia came prepared with printed prescriptions and a dry explanation of why consistency matters. Prison doctors are also people, some harsh, some steady. She found one who signed without sarcasm. Sophia thanked her with her eyes. It is the only currency here that does not lose value. The appeal ran in parallel with the prison calendar, like a second reality. The lawyer sent summaries, which arguments were accepted, what was attached, where the court asked for clarification. Each letter was a 1-minute window. Sometimes news came about public support. Someone wrote pieces about cases like hers. Someone argued in social media. Sophia read carefully. Support warms you, but hope can burn you. She learned to keep 2 levels at once, do everything possible in law, and keep herself with daily small things. An appeal is a marathon without a track. You run in place and hope the court is somewhere ahead. The turning point of this story is not that the walls suddenly vanished. They did not. The turning point is that Sophia stopped confusing meaning and form. She learned where her voice is not heard because it is translated, and where it goes quiet because she is tired. She learned to treat words like a resource, save them on pointless fights, spend them on fixing what matters. She learned that a document without a person is dangerous, but in this system, a person without a document also loses. She had to do what she did not want to, tame the paper so it would stop biting. Another change happened in daily interactions. In the barracks, a few people began to say Sophia without a pause, not all and not right away. At first, a couple did it stubbornly, as a show of support. Later, it became a habit. Habits create reality. In a colony, any habit is precious. It pushes back a routine that sees you only as a line in a ledger. Sophia told newcomers what she had learned the hard way. Make lists, guard your sleep, do not read everything, refuse curious conversations, keep a paper with important phone numbers, and always push to correct your name in papers, not as a manifesto, as a welding manual. When the appeal ruling came, it was read in an office with a metal cabinet, partly granted, part sent back, the rest left in force. In legal terms, it meant there was a crack, but the wall still stood. Emotionally, the air moved. The lawyer said without pathos, "We continue." Sophia nodded. In that phrase lived everything she had learned. Do not confuse hope with magic. Do not rent out your name. Do not turn someone else's rudeness into your own fragility. What had changed for her by then? She stopped being only the heroine of her trouble. She became a person who can turn threats into processes. It does not sound pretty, but it works. She found a language to speak to the system so it hears her, at least technically. She found a language to speak to herself so she does not dissolve. Meaning returned to simple things. Her mother's handwriting in letters, a straight seam on a shirt, the phrase, "Sophia checked in the crew leader's notebook without quotes. That's a small victory that is quiet, which is why it is real. What changed beyond her? The story opened old seams. When medical boards become theater, when protocols confuse your name with your potential guilt, when colonies rank discipline over dignity, everyone who wants to look can see it. Sophia did not become a symbol. She became a reason to stop pretending the problem lives far away. Her story does not need applause. It needs one more tool in offices that love the word objectivity, respect, not as a favor, but as a norm. In the evening, when the barracks went quiet, she wrote one line at a time in a notebook. Today, they used my name. Today, I did not answer a provocation. Today, a letter arrived on time. These lines became a diary with no pretty endings. It had consistency. Consistency keeps you alive when the world around you is all rules that are easier to manage than people. The turning point is that she stayed herself where there were no conditions for it. She did, because every day she took one small step toward her own reality and not someone else's instruction. This is a story about how personal life turns into a paper case when it is convenient for the system. Sophia went from public talk about her body to medical exams, a criminal case, a verdict, and life in a colony. At each stage, the same dilemma. When a document does not see a person, the person has to tame the document. She held on to her name and voice, learned to speak calmly, to record what matters, and to build small habits that give control back. This is not about heroism. It is about survival and dignity when decisions are made without you. If you value stories without sensations but with analysis and consequences, support the project so we can keep telling them. Share this episode, argue on the merits, and guard people's right to boundaries and a name, and answer in the comments. Where, in your view, did the mechanism fail the most in this story? In medicine, in the investigation, in court, or in the colony?